Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Drugs and the FDA, Safety, Efficacy, and the Public's Trust by Mikkael Sekeres, narrated by Mike Lenz. Preface. The United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, is the most trusted regulatory body in the world. Because of the confidence we place in the agency, we have the luxury of ignoring, or casually tossing out, the complicated labels and package inserts it writes for our medications, or of muting the television commercials that urge us to consult a physician if we experience the following side effects. But no matter how we look at it, the FDA's responsibility, and thus its effect on our lives, is enormous. That was made crystal clear through its emergency use authorization and eventual approval of vaccines to combat COVID-19. The FDA protects the public health in myriad ways by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. It helps to speed innovations that make medical products more effective, safer, and more affordable, and it helps the public get the accurate, science-based information they need to use medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. The FDA also regulates more than $1 trillion worth of products each year. Because of the FDA, as a doctor, I can comfortably prescribe medications, knowing their potential risks and benefits. And as a patient and consumer, I can take medications with the same confidence. Frankly, because of the FDA, my patients and I are living far longer and much better than if we had been born a century earlier. The legislation that led to its birth, though, resulted from tragedy. And this history, along with how the FDA has evolved in response to public pressure, informs the decisions it makes about drug approvals today. Prior to the 20th century, drug manufacturers could hawk any potion, claim treatment of any ailment, and hail efficacy or potency on a bottle's label to any extent that they wanted, all in the name of increasing sales. After all, no agency had authority to rein them in or to ensure that their manufacturing processes and distribution plans were consistent and safe. But then dozens of children were given poisoned vaccines for smallpox and diphtheria, and many died. This is particularly poignant as we have debated the safety of vaccines sanctioned under an emergency use authorization for the treatment of that other infection, COVID-19, and whether we should trust the FDA's assessment of their safety. Soon after, the first federal regulations of biologic products were put into place. Then, it took the deaths of dozens of children and adults, all prescribed an antibiotic by their trusted family doctors, before the FDA was empowered to actually require that drugs be safe for ingestion or injection. But the clout to demand whether drugs actually work, to demand they be effective, that took thousands of children from around the world being born terribly disfigured, without arms, sometimes without legs or ears, and sometimes with just the ghostly suggestion of any of these appendages. Because of its unholy birth, the FDA is cautious before it approves drugs for marketing in the United States. Embedded in its very DNA, first and foremost, is its mission to ensure a drug's safety, safety, safety. As a result, medicines given marketing approval in the United States are considered the safest in the world. But for people with life-threatening illnesses who see their own mortality staring at them starkly at preternaturally young ages, like the patient James Petrarcha portrayed in this book, a composite of the people I have cared for, the FDA can be maddeningly deliberate and slow to get medicines approved. When confronting a deadly scourge of unknown cause and undiscovered cure, be it AIDS or COVID-19, particularly with a cold and uncaring government in power, a community faced with just such a health crisis revolts, protesting loudly enough to be heard to provoke change. And once again, the FDA did change. It introduced accelerated approval, a formal process to get drugs to the patients who really need them sooner, a mechanism that, sure enough, gets new drugs to patients desperate to treat serious, life-threatening conditions fast. Well, fast by FDA standards. Many of these drugs have in fact revolutionized the treatment of conditions like cancer, making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's lives better. Some have not been as transformative, though, and their rush to market may have violated the FDA's own DNA to ensure the safety of the public. Drugs and the FDA, safety, efficacy, and the public's trust tracks the FDA's progress, beginning with the agency's genesis more than 100 years ago. The story unfolds against the backdrop of the Avastin hearing, an unprecedented trial that took place in 2011 involving a wunderkind breast cancer drug that pit the drug's manufacturer, Genentech, against the FDA itself. Avastin was one of the dozens of drugs brought to market during the past 2 to 3 decades under the FDA's accelerated approval mechanism. At this trial, I and 5 other cancer specialists served as the jury. Charged with deciding the fate of this drug, taken by tens of thousands of women with breast cancer around the world, we would vote to recommend to either keep it on the market or remove it. At this trial, dozens of brave women with breast cancer played witness to Avastin's ability to keep them alive for years, hardy and hale enough to testify before us. Yet dozens of other women with breast cancer, also treated with Avastin, were no longer alive to testify. At this trial, we saw how studies of cancer drugs can be built to win, to gain regulatory approval, without necessarily benefiting patients. We witnessed the tension in the FDA's mission to balance a drug's safety and efficacy with promoting innovation and rapidly meeting the needs of sick and dying patients. The Avastin hearing would put to the test not only the FDA's century-long evolution, but also the trust the public holds in this federal agency to safeguard our health in treating cancer, cardiovascular disease, AIDS, or COVID-19, and the FDA's decision about whether to maintain Avastin's breast cancer approval or revoke it would be the ultimate demonstration of how the agency's system of checks and balances really works, or in how it doesn't. MAS. 1. This little drug came to market. I have known hours when death for me would be a welcome relief. A.S. Calhoun, M.D., Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1937. The 130-acre White Oak campus of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is located 1 mile north of the Capitol Beltway in Montgomery County, Maryland, making it convenient to get to by car. Its fragmented buildings house the Office of the Commissioner, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and offices for the Center for Veterinary Medicine. The site, acquired by the U.S. Department of the Navy in 1944, originally housed the Dahlgren Division of the Naval Surface Warfare Center, White Oak Detachment, which developed and tested ballistics, torpedoes, mines, and other explosives. In 1993, the Navy moved its operations and transferred the site to the General Services Administration. The FDA then occupied the campus in 2009. True to its military origins, the main ingress to the FDA, Building 1, resembles a fortress and still has Naval Ordnance Laboratory etched in stone on its frontispiece. The quarter-mile-long Mahan Road, named for the 19th century naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, leads from New Hampshire Avenue and ends with a circular driveway in front of the building. The low-slung glass entrance, accessible only by navigating a row of cement pillar barricades, fronts a 4-story, imposing red brick building with long, vertical windows, opaque when viewed from the outside. On the inside, TSA-level security awaits visitors, who must also wear black and white photo identification stickers while on the premises. At any given time, taxis or Uber or Lyft vehicles line the drive, along with the occasional catering service delivery car or corporate limousine. But early in the morning of June 28, 2011, 7 police cruisers bearing the insignia of the Department of Homeland Security Federal Protective Service and the Montgomery County Police Department blocked the campus entrance from casual visitors. A crowd had started to form on New Hampshire Avenue. Many people wore pink T-shirts with a white ribbon on the front and the words, "Avastin works, let doctors and patients decide," on the back. Some carried homemade signs with pictures of families and messages of "breast cancer patients are not statistics," and "it's my cancer, it should be my decision." On this day, the FDA would hold a hearing to decide whether to withdraw its previous approval of the drug bevacizumab, brand name Avastin, the anti-angiogenesis wunderkind born from studies conducted by the Harvard researcher Judah Folkman for the treatment of metastatic breast cancer. Studies from his laboratory showed that killing the blood vessel growth, and thus the blood supply to tumors, could eliminate the tumors themselves. Representatives of the FDA would face off against the attorneys and leadership of Avastin's manufacturer, Genentech, who desperately wanted to keep their blockbuster drug on the market for breast cancer. Protest organizer Terry Calley from Troy, Michigan, whose wife Arlene had battled breast cancer for over 30 years and eventually was treated with Avastin herself when the cancer became metastatic, stood in front of a crowd. Wearing one of the pink T-shirts, he held up a white megaphone to speak to those gathered, using language more commonly invoked at abortion rights rallies, pinning a woman's choice, in this case, to have access to Avastin, against a government agency's proposed restrictions to that choice. Today, it's Avastin for women with breast cancer. Tomorrow, it's the next drug that you or a loved one may need. This is a national disgrace, Calley shouted. A folk singer, Andrew Katz, sported one of the same pink T-shirts, along with dark shades, as he strummed a guitar and played the harmonica, singing the Bob Dylan-esque Avastin protest anthem. Now I tell this story and I tell it right. Tell about women in a hell of a fight. Mothers, sisters, daughters too. Americans, just like me and you. 17,500 of them. Cancer in their breast. Tell you what, son, boy, dad, pops, Mr. President, it's a hell of a test. These sorts of issues, a government agency's regulatory reach, patient autonomy and access to drugs for life-threatening conditions, testimonials from patients and doctors, assessment of drug safety and efficacy, and the precedent set by preventing the sales and marketing of a drug were not new to the FDA, and, in fact, had both colored and informed its authority for over a century. But it begged the question, had the FDA made a mistake in approving the drug in the first place? 120 years earlier, therapeutic options for breast cancer were far more limited, and a regulatory body that had the authority to review safety and efficacy data for a drug and allow its marketing for a specific medical indication had not yet been created. Imagine, back then, that you'd noticed a lump growing in your breast. You go to see the only doctor in your small town, who may even have confirmed that it was likely a cancer, but isn't able to perform the disfiguring surgery that William Stewart Halstead, M.D., a professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins University, would first describe in 1894, removing the breast tissue, underlying muscles, and lymph nodes that could cure some women. This surgical approach had only become possible because of the rapid improvements in anesthesia and in aseptic technique that occurred in medicine during the latter part of the 19th century. In fact, Halstead's radical surgery would remain the standard treatment for breast cancer for more than 80 years, until Bernard Fisher, M.D., a surgeon from the University of Pittsburgh, bucked fierce opposition from his colleagues in demonstrating that a modified surgical approach was far less debilitating and worked just as well. Fisher was one of the first doctors to question traditional medical decision-making, which was often based on anecdotes, personal experiences, testimonials, and opinions. He once famously told a reporter, "In God we trust. All others must have data." Breast cancer has been documented in written records for more than 4,000 years, centuries before modern imaging techniques like CT scans and MRIs, or autopsies, revealed the inner mysteries of the human body. It was easier to detect than many other cancers because it wasn't hidden somewhere in the abdomen or the chest. But even though it arose close to the body's surface, breast cancer often wasn't recognized until it had started eating through the skin covering the breast, and in those cases was hidden from friends and even close family members, out of shame. Back in the town doctor's office, he shakes his head, pitying you and frustrated at the limits of medicine, particularly in rural parts of the country. He tells you that some cancers grow slowly, so maybe you'll be one of the lucky few, then instructs you on ways to hide the lump and mask the rancid smell of the ulcer expanding over it. The following month, a traveling medicine show with a performance troupe comes to town, advertising Hamlin's Wizard Oil, a patent medicine and wondrous cure for ailments that range from toothache, rheumatism, lame back, hydrophobia, and pneumonia, all the way to cancer. Its cocksure slogan brags, "There is no sore it will not heal, no pain it will not subdue." The oil works so well, the advertisement claims, that it can be used topically, as a liniment, or ingested. It is said to contain alcohol, camphor, sassafras oil, clove oil, turpentine, ammonia, and chloroform, ingredients that seem more appropriate for a potent wallpaper remover than a medicinal cure-all. Frankly, you don't have any other treatment options, so you hand 35 cents to the barker who stands near a case of this wondrous oil. In reality, the actual formula for this batch probably varies to include, aside from alcohol, whatever the manufacturers had on hand at the time. You swallow your first dose of the solution that night. Weeks go by, but despite your taking the nostrum religiously, the mass in your breast continues to worsen, and now you've developed a gastric ulcer, which prevents you from taking in a decent meal. You lose weight, get weaker, and 6 months from the time the medicine show came to town, you die, either from complications of breast cancer or from the side effects of Hamlin's liniment. Throughout the 19th century, entrepreneurs in the United States had absolute freedom to manufacture and market any food or drug in any way and for any purpose. It wasn't until 1902 that progress toward regulation of food and drugs began. Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, started assessing drug ingredients in nostrums like the one manufactured by Hamlin and discovered that many were either misbranded or completely adulterated. He was not alone. A crusade of lobbyists, including the Women's Christian Temperance Movement and the General Federation of Women's Clubs, led by the activist Alice Lakey, also feared for their safety and the safety of their families, and started pushing for a bill to move through Congress that would more formally regulate drugs. While it may not have been a complete surprise that patent medicines such as Benjamin Brandreth's Vegetable Universal Pill, a cathartic so well known it was even mentioned in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, were not the medicinal panaceas they claimed to be, this was the first time the nostrums were called out officially by a government agency. But the bill didn't get far until tragedy struck. Around the same time, at the dawn of the 20th century, a diphtheria outbreak occurred in St. Louis, and a smallpox outbreak arose in Camden, New Jersey. Diphtheria antitoxin was made by inoculating horses with increasingly concentrated doses of diphtheria toxin, so that the horses' immune systems would produce antibodies to attack the toxin, and then bleeding the animals to obtain their serum, and more importantly, the antibodies contained in the serum. When this antitoxin was then injected into a patient suffering from diphtheria, the antibodies in the horse serum neutralized the patient's toxin, enabling the patient to survive the infection. This approach to treating infection was similar in theory to the antibody therapy used to treat COVID-19 infections starting in 2020. Smallpox vaccine, on the other hand, was often produced on the skin of calves. Both production methods, both uncontrolled and without formal regulation, were prone to errors. Diphtheria antitoxin and smallpox vaccines were manufactured and then shipped to the sick people in St. Louis and Camden to treat their life-threatening infections. But in a horrible irony, both were contaminated during the manufacturing process with another deadly toxin, tetanus. 22 children inoculated with the tainted vaccines died, not from diphtheria or smallpox, but from tetanus. In response, Congress passed the Biologics Control Act of 1902, also known as the Virus Toxin Law, after it was signed by Theodore Roosevelt on July 1st of that year. It was the first law that instituted federal regulations of biologic products, in which a board that included the Surgeons General of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Hospital Service had the power to issue, suspend, and revoke licenses to produce products such as vaccines. Laboratories could be inspected, and fines or even prison sentences issued for violations. Perhaps more importantly, the Biologics Control Act started a crusade for a law that would cover more than just biologics, but all drugs and food. At around 7:30 a.m. on that hot June day in 2011, many of the pro-Avastin protesters drifted toward the entrance of Building 1. After passing the many police cars, barricades, the formidable building's entrance, and the security checkpoint, they walked by a small historical display of some of the FDA's accomplishments, headed down a hallway, and then exited through a small courtyard to reach Building 31, where the hearing on Avastin would take place in the room 1503, known as the Great Room. The white shuttle bus bringing me and the 6 other members of the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee, ODAC, of the FDA, took an alternate route from the Hilton Hotel in Silver Spring, Maryland, where we had spent the night. It drove past the protesters and our usual destination at FDA Building 1, depositing us instead at the entrance to the nondescript Building 32 to receive our temporary badges and run the gauntlet through a smaller security area before heading to the hearing. Our job as ODAC members was typically to evaluate data concerning the safety and efficacy of marketed and investigational drugs for use in the treatment of cancer, and then to make recommendations to the FDA Commissioner. But that day we would serve as the hearing's jury. A member of the FDA itself had already informed us that it might be helpful to think of this debate between the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, the arm of the FDA that regulates over-the-counter and prescription drugs, and Genentech, as a trial. Both the agency and the company would present witnesses who would try to make the case for their respective positions. From Genentech, that Avastin should remain on the market, retaining its breast cancer indication, and for the FDA, that the breast cancer indication should be withdrawn. The opposing party would then question those witnesses. We would then have an opportunity to question those witnesses, as would the presiding officer for the FDA, Karen Midthun, MD. Finally, the party presenting the witnesses would have a chance to ask clarifying questions of its own witnesses. We would have a busy couple of days ahead of us, reviewing the evidence supporting Avastin's safety and efficacy track record across multiple clinical trials, then hearing the testimonies of physician experts and individual patients who have taken the drug, the women I would consider to be particular experts about the drug's side effects and its impact on beating back breast cancer, and finally, asking questions of the people making presentations at the hearing. We would then provide advice and recommendations to the FDA, advice on whether it should continue to allow the company to market Avastin to the tens of thousands of women with metastatic breast cancer who had few other treatment options, Genentech's contention, or whether the toxicities of the drug outweighed its potential benefit, and it should therefore be withdrawn from the market, FDA's position. We would vote publicly for all to see in real time whether we were for or against Avastin. The FDA Commissioner would then make the final decision on whether or not to withdraw Avastin's label for metastatic breast cancer. Throughout the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th, Concern over toxicities from drugs that were wantonly being peddled grew along with worry over the safety of a much more basic human need, food. With the Industrial Revolution, food production occurred on a large scale in the United States, and inventions like canning allowed food to be shipped around the country on the vast railway network that had also been built. But some nefarious manufacturers used spices or other additives to mask the taste of expired meat or other substandard ingredients that they packaged in the cans, and food poisoning outbreaks occurred frequently right up to the dawn of the 20th century. In an attempt to introduce standards and regulate these products, a national pure food and drugs bill had actually passed the House twice, but both times without Senate action. A final push to move a bill through Congress occurred with the help of two writers. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published his novel The Jungle, the main purpose of which was to highlight the harsh working conditions of immigrants in Chicago and other industrialized cities. It was supposed to be a socialist polemic. Sinclair, a journalist, spent 7 weeks in 1904 working undercover in a meatpacking plant in the Chicago stockyards to get material for a series of articles he wrote for a socialist newspaper in 1905, as well as for his book. Rather than heeding the socialist message Sinclair was trying to promote, many readers focused instead on sections of the book describing the unsanitary practices and health violations that occurred in the plant, how diseased, rotten, and contaminated meats were processed, doctored by chemicals, and mislabeled for sale to the public, and how, after hours, when no meat inspectors were around, workers processed dead and injured animals that were not supposed to be sold for human consumption. The Jungle became the most popular book in the country, leading Sinclair to quip, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Also, in 1905, the journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams published a 12-part series on the fraudulence and dangers of the patent medicine industry in Collier's magazine. Adams, who could be considered the Michael Moore of his day, was an American muckraker from the Progressive era who exposed institutions or leaders as being corrupt. The term was popularized in a speech given by Theodore Roosevelt in 1906, in which he conceded, "The men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society, but only if they know when to stop raking the muck." His comment alluded to a muck-rake-wielding character in Paul Bunyan's 1678 classic Pilgrim's Progress, who could look no way but downward, his interest only in raking filth. Adams had a huge impact on the public perception of so-called cure-alls. His Collier series was a damning expose of medical charlatanry, in which he called out fake practitioners by name, revealed the alcohol and narcotic content of specific nostrums, and made clear the profitable codependence of patent medicine advertisers and publishers. In one such description of the drug Peruna, he wrote, "Anyone wishing to make Peruna for home consumption may do so by mixing half a pint of cologne spirits, 190 proof, with a pint and a half of water, adding thereto a little cubebs for flavor and a little burned sugar for color. Manufactured in bulk, so a former Peruna agent estimates, its cost, including bottle and wrapper, is between 15 and 18 cents a bottle. Its price is $1. Concerns about profiteering from high drug costs, which can far outstrip research and development expenses, is not just a modern century phenomenon. The series of articles would be collected in an edition called The Great American Fraud, reprinted by the American Medical Association, which sold 500,000 copies at 50 cents per copy. Partly as a result, the AMA established the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry, an in-house lab that analyzed the contents of patent medicines and determined which products were worthy of being granted permission to advertise in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This was at a time when medical journals and magazines vetted the advertisements included in their pages as they might have done for scientific articles, viewing them as a tacit endorsement of the product advertised.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?